So, of colleagues here, we'll start with my good friend Bodo Elements from the Global Policy Forum Europe, who will give us an introduction of the FFD process. After that, Emilia Reyes from Equidad de Género will give us, because we're meeting here in the context of all this discussion about the summit of the future, and therefore will give some critical analysis on soft and how it links or it doesn't to the FFD4 process. And then we have three colleagues. I will introduce them when we get there. They will give us the snapshots of the critical proposals that the mechanism puts forward for the conference, in particular on the tax convention, on the debt convention, and the international development cooperation convention. And then Bhumika, she's on her way, will close up with some consideration on the wider systemic financial and monetary reform agenda and how the process moves forwards from here. So without further ado, Bodo, floor is yours. Let me give you the microphone.
Hey, hello everyone. Yeah, I'm indeed Bodo Elmers from Global Policy Forum Europe. I had the pleasure to participate in the last two FFD conferences, FFD2 in Doha in 2008 and FFD3 in Addis Ababa in 2015, and also in all the Financing for Development forums since then. So I think this is why the task fell on me to give an introduction in the process. Stefano said it actually already quite well, but just to make clear, I mean, FFD conferences are not pledging conferences, so it's not like raising money for specific institution or development tasks. It's really a norm-setting conference, and we hope it's an institution-building conference. So the ambitions are high indeed to reform the international financial architecture, to reform trade institutions, and basically to work on the systemic issues, as Stefano also put it. And indeed, I mean, the FFD process is the one process at the United Nations where all these finance topics come together. So it's not, I mean, some people, when you hear development finance, some people think about official development assistance. This is also on the agenda. Here, Meja is our expert on these topics. It's actually part of the international public finance stream in the FFD process. But the FFD process deals with all potential sources of finance, public and private, domestic and international, and essentially also with the institutions that mobilize and regulate it. So this just as an introduction to understand. And yeah, and indeed, and it's the inclusive space we have in global economic governance to talk about these issues, because many of these issues are, of course, also discussed in other forums, the G20, the G7, the OECD, but this is basically the space where all countries have a seat at the table, and which is also quite open for civil society participation. So that's actually the legitimate place to make governance decision in this regard. Yeah, you see the key milestones already. We are moving now towards the fourth conference on financing for development. Actually, we are already a bit delayed. Usually the sequence of this conferences should be about 5 years, but we actually campaigned for several years just for getting the mandate for the new FFD4 conference. So even this was a challenge. It's hard to understand because, you know, the G20 has a summit every year. The UN fights hard to get any mandate basically to organize these FFD4 conferences. But finally, actually, a couple of years later than we actually expected to, we have now the road to the FFD4 conference clear and laid out. And this is how it looks like. The first preparatory committee meeting in Addis Ababa took already place. It was in July. According to the modalities resolution, the idea was actually that the first PrepCom mostly looks back at what has been achieved and takes stock and looks at the constraints in implementing financing for development agreements. Actually, there was relatively little space devoted to this in Addis Ababa, and most country interventions were already forward-looking. So people were quite keen to address current issues and to look into the future. And there are also, of course, a lot of issues to address. And okay, second step, we are here. You see in between there are some events which are not part of the financing for development process, but which are related to it. Today, of course, the Summit of the Future. Then in November, we have the G20 Summit in Rio. And then in April, IMF World Bank spring meetings. They're not part of the process, but they might somehow influence the process. But yeah, I mean, the key upcoming thing now is on the 15th of October, we have the deadline for submissions to the elements paper. The elements paper will be the basis for the outcome document, the draft outcome document. And we expect the draft outcome document to be released in around the CEO draft to be released somewhere around the turn of the year, December or January, December 24 or January 25. Just from experience, we had quite different experiences in this financing for development process with outcome documents. The first one in Monterey was agreed before the summit took place. There was a condition at this time by the President of the United States who said he would only attend when there are no negotiations at the conference. Then the second conference was quite a drama in Doha. Actually, it looked like as if the conference would fall apart and there will be no outcome document at all. The reason for this was this happened right in the middle of the global financial crisis, so it was an extremely hot issue. And also the G20 had just emerged as a competitive body, so there was a lot of back and forth. And actually, we did get an outcome document, but it was so contested that the President of the General Assembly called for another conference to take place in New York on the financial crisis the following year. So that was Doha. And the third one in Addis Ababa, we went to the conference with just one open paragraph. The only open paragraph was the one on tax, which actually made it quite easy for CSOs to decide on what we campaign and advocate for in Addis, because everyone was focusing on the one tax paragraph, and it was the debate on tax governance, on the tax body, which then now, almost 10 years later, led to the tax convention process we're seeing now. So that's it. So the first preparatory committee meeting already took place. We have 3 more scheduled, one in September here in New York. The third is unfortunately also in New York. It was originally supposed to take place in Mexico, and we all like Mexico City, so we are a bit, but it seems that the one in Addis Ababa was so expensive that the donors said it should rather take place in headquarters, which is good for everyone based in New York. It makes it way more expensive for us who are flying in. But yeah, so that's the thing. So the most of the process that follows will take place here in New York. And yeah, and then later, of course, the FFD4 conference will take place in Sevilla in Spain in late June and early July. It's the first time that this conference take place in global north country, if you want to say so, in Europe, in a developed country. We don't know if this will make a difference compared to the previous ones, but that's the state of play. Sevilla is very hot in late June, so get prepared for this if you're planning to go. But then, of course, Spain is a very nice country, good food, nice people, so we're all looking forward to it. And I stop here. Yeah, and I stop here.
Thanks, Bodo, including for the Spanish tourist information, which I think is always useful, or survival information, as Yolanda puts it. Emilia, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, colleagues. It's very nice to be with you all here. It's been a while since I haven't been here in September, mostly because I don't think ONGA needs us as much as the rest of the year when the processes are happening, and that's where our inputs are very much needed. But this is a very welcome panel because as we are contrasting what just happened now in the UN hallways, we are very much look forward to seeing something meaningful. The civil society FFD mechanism has been very critical of the Summit of the Future. We were very critical ever since it started with its inception in our common agenda, which is a proposal by the Secretary General. There are different views within the mechanism. I'm one of the more radicals. So to me, the idea of our common agenda is very much an agenda of the Secretary General, but they're very much in line with the common position of the civil society FFD mechanism. We should be aiming at member states-led processes. And so there is a difference between what comes from the top down than what comes from the decision of member states. So there was a lot of pushing from the Secretary General and also developed countries. Actually, the G77 was looking forward more to engage in those processes that were meaningful to them, including the process that led to the tax convention, and definitely more leading to the FFD conference. You know, the developing countries have very much small delegations, and they had very limited capacity to attend. And the framing of their common agenda that led to the Pact for the Future was so wide that all of the missions were really running from one meeting to the other without really grasping what was being discussed there and what is underneath the Summit of the Future. Of course, there are many issues that are very technical, such as, for instance, the Digital Compact. But therefore also it was a huge agenda that was supposedly meant to be inspiring for the new multilateralism that we want. But in that point of entry, it became problematic, because how can you be inspiring without really having the will to transform the colonial and imperial logics that are underlying the multilateral system? So that's precisely what happened. It was a repetition of the same dynamics. And then we came to a point in which from the very beginning, the FFD mechanism was very critical, because at the start of our common agenda, alongside many promises of topics that were very much at the heart of the civil society agenda, there were also points of entry that were very problematic, such as, for instance, opening the door for a board of the digital tycoons to sit down within the UN to make decisions on the digital agenda. Or also, for instance, which is survive, is the idea of a biennial summit in which governments of the G20, etc., would come and sit at the table and make decisions. Whereas, again, we are saying G20 members already have their groupings, the negotiation groupings. So, and for many of us, bodies like G7, G20, they are illegitimate spaces of power, because their focus is just mostly because of their wealth. So the premise that just because of you have wealth, you get to decide on everything that happens globally, and the destiny of the people and the planet, it's not only unfair, it's very much against the interests of people and the planet. So those premises of who sits at the table and makes decisions goes very much against the spirit of the civil society mechanism. So we're always calling from the beginning to go back to the nature of UN processes that are multilaterally in the sense of going back to the principle of one country, one vote, that even the smallest country has to get to sit at the table and has a say at the table, against this idea that the Secretary General was pushing on multi-stakeholder multilateralism, which is precisely bringing the corporations, especially the multinational corporations, at the table to have a say alongside us and other spaces of power, such as I was mentioning, not only the G20, but also the international financial institution to have a larger say, even more than they have already, without recognizing the lack of democratic nature of these bodies that are actually proposing more indebtedness, more austerity measure, more conditionalities, tying our countries in the South to further and further entrenching policies that are really asphyxiating ourselves, and without tackling the larger logics. For instance, I don't know if you heard last year with the Ecuador's project of the Yasuni, when there was a referendum where people voted to leave the fossil fuels in the ground. Well, immediately 2 days later, the credit rating agencies decided that Ecuador was not suitable for investments anymore, and they lowered the ranking. So this type of logics that are global, that are very much at the heart of what the FFD conference will tackle, they were not addressed in the soft process. So this is what is very dangerous, to just keep on cheering on a document that promises to be inspirational, that promises to be transformative, but very much ratifying all of the logics that have led us to the point in which we are. So we do say there is an option. There is an option against the Pact for the Future, and it's precisely the FFD conference, in which we will come and see to discuss, as Bora was saying, this is a normative agenda. What does this say? It means that we can change the rules of the game, that the rules of the game are biased, are thwarted against the Global South, and we get to have a say as a majority that we are. And this has been exemplified in the tax convention, which is very inspiring with the with the leadership of the Africa group. And we think that this can very much happen with the leadership of Global South countries, and of course, with the support of social movements and civil society. So this is very much our position. Okay, that's not going to be in the mic. No, so just going back to the lessons in multilateralism, we think that the aim of the soft processing targeting the international financial reform, it was a scam. As you saw, even for instance, the language on debt, the paragraph that was very much contended until the very last document in breaking the silence procedure, it says very much that the debt agenda will continue to be in the hands of the G20 and the IMF. In the common framework. What we are saying, you will hear our colleagues here, how is it that we do want a reform of the international financial architecture with a strengthening on new institutions that deliver on debt, on tax justice, on technology justice, on, on each of the elements that are very much at the heart of the problems we are facing. So very much also in the line of the inspiration of the tax convention. So we do have this question that is very risky. What we had with the adoption of a document such as that one is leading us to very dangerous waters. However, it is not binding. So it is my hope that they will just read it and not take it up again, because if it's ratifying what we already have, then what is the point of having a document such as that? But very much, we do have an opportunity to move forward in very radical, really structural agendas that are not technical tweaks, and that will come with the FFD conference. So I will just leave my colleagues to state precisely what are the demands that we want and that are not reflected in the Pact for the Future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emilia. After these two initial interventions, then we'll go into some of the elements of our proposals. I'll invite you to visit the website of the mechanism, CSO for FFD, so you find it easily, in which you already find our demands. There are many across all the different pillars, but what we're going to present you, three critical proposals, probably the ones that we push forward more forcefully, but they're also an exemplification of the kind of normative developments and institutional developments that we think about when we think about FFD. So we'll start with tax, debt, and development cooperation. Rodolfo, over to you.
Thank you, Stefano. Yes. I will take the advantage we have interpretation, so I will speak in Spanish. Soy Rodolfo Bejarano, de la Red Latinoamericana por Justicia Económica y Social Latindad. Estoy basado en Perú y es un placer estar acá compartiendo con ustedes. Bueno, somos también miembros del mecanismo de sociedad civil de FFD. Bueno, en el tema de tributación, tenemos ya varios años en esta lucha. Muchos de ustedes seguramente conocerán que hace poco se ha aprobado ya la convención, los términos de referencia que van a marcar, digamos, el inicio de las discusiones para una convención marco, ¿no? De tributación, de cooperación de tributación, en la tributación. Es un espacio que consideramos muy importante, un paso muy importante. No es, digamos, la batalla ganada totalmente, pero es sí un avance. Tener ya esta decisión, resolución dentro de Naciones Unidas para que se discuta en un espacio más democrático, más participativo y con igualdad de condiciones, en la que todos los países van a poder colocar también sus intereses, sus preocupaciones e inclusive también partes interesadas como la sociedad civil, ¿no? Desde sociedad civil hemos estado participando en todo este proceso, inclusive desde Addis Abeba, cuando se hizo la tercera conferencia del FFD, ya desde ese entonces había, digamos, un pedido, ¿no? Una demanda que teníamos de que se establezca esta convención tributaria. En ese momento se llamaba, o le decíamos el tax body, el cuerpo intergubernamental en Naciones Unidas que discuta sobre estos temas. Bueno, a través de los años se ha ido avanzando, a través de las redes y organizaciones que vienen trabajando estos temas, también la participación de todos nosotros, digamos, a través del mecanismo de sociedad civil en las reuniones oficiales, en las discusiones que se habían dado y que se venían dando en estos temas, digamos que dieron sus frutos. Hay que reconocer la posición fuerte que tuvo el grupo africano, ¿no? Los países africanos, digamos, han sido importantísimos para que se pueda llegar hasta este punto, ¿no? Luego de que ellos, digamos, pusieran su posición fuerte en este tema, luego siguieron los demás países en desarrollo, el G77. Entonces creo que eso para nosotros es estamos en un momento muy importante, ¿no? Con esa pequeña batalla ganada, pero por supuesto que aún falta por hacer mucho más. Estamos, digamos, hablando de que se van a discutir recién los términos de que, en los que esta convención se va a dar en los próximos años. Y luego, bueno, habría que ver también cómo se van a ejecutar. Y también si es que hay otros temas que han quedado fuera que también se vayan incorporando, porque no solamente estamos hablando de que tributen las empresas transnacionales, donde deberían tributar, sino también las grandes riquezas. Estamos hablando de que se detengan los flujos financieros ilícitos, que se luche contra la evasión y la elusión tributaria. Y bueno, todo ese entramado que existe a nivel mundial de paraísos fiscales o guaridas fiscales, como le decimos, que también eso sea abordado, ¿no? Entonces, todavía falta mucho por hacer, pero, digamos, es la demanda que tenemos de que ya se instale de una vez esa convención tributaria en Naciones Unidas y se empiecen a discutir estos temas de manera más amplia, ¿no? Y no solamente que las reglas actuales respondan a los países más ricos. Entonces me quedo acá y le doy la palabra.
Gracias. Okay, thanks. I'm Yolanda Fresnillo. I am coordinating the debt justice work at Eurodat, but also together with LatinDat, with Afrodat, APMDD, coordinating the debt justice workstream within the civil society FFD mechanism. This is an open invitation for all of you who want to work on that to join us. We have a call tomorrow to start preparing the road to FFD4 on debt justice. Reach out to me afterwards if you want to participate, or if you cannot join tomorrow because you're all here busy. There will be other occasions. Let me start by saying very little about where we are, and then what we want from the Financing for Development for conference. We are in the worst debt crisis ever. And this might seem not in coincidence with the concerns that the UN, through, for instance, the Pact of the Future, highlights about debt vulnerabilities, about what you hear from the IMF, from the G20. There are some countries facing some debt distress. The truth is that Global South countries never, ever devoted as much part of their budgets to paying domestic and external debts. Never, ever before. So much resources, needed resources for education, for health, for climate, were being devoted not to public services, not to climate action, but to paying off external and also domestic creditors. This is why we're saying it's the worst crisis ever. The IMF is saying, oh, the worst of the crisis is over because, you know, countries are not defaulting. Countries are not defaulting because they are applying dramatic cuts in their budgets. Countries are not defaulting because they are doing whatever it takes, even defaulting on their people and defaulting on climate, not to default on the markets. This is why they are not seeing this as a crisis because it's not affecting the creditors because they are being paid. But it is in development and human terms the worst debt crisis ever. Then we have the IMF and the G20 leading on how we solve this non-crisis according to them. So they have put on the table the common framework. So far, only 4 countries have applied to this common framework. No debt cancellation is offered to any country today. Don't be fooled by the words of debt relief. What is offered to them is rescheduling of the debt of the payment terms, and then they have some savings because with this delay and maybe a little bit of lower interest rates, they save some money, but private creditors are still getting all their money back plus interest. Bilateral creditors are still getting their money back plus interest. The IMF and the World Bank are still getting all their money back plus interest. In the case of the IMF, even up to 8% or 9% interest rates. So it's not concessional, it's not support, it is a business. So no debt cancellation, creditors leading on how this problem needs to be solved, and SDGs, climate action, human rights being defaulted on. We want this to change. We want debt cancellation now. We want unconditional debt cancellation, and there's going to be lots of campaigning coming on. But we also want to change the system. We want to change the structures that decide on how debt crises are being prevented and how debt crises are being resolved when they happen. So we are calling for member states to decide to agree at the 4th UN International Financing for Development Conference to adopt a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. I know this might seem repetitive from what we have and is being discussed in tax, but it is the tool that we have under the UN. We have been calling for a long time for the UN to build what we call a debt workout mechanism, a debt resolution mechanism, but we think we need to go beyond that. We need the UN and the member states in equal footing, borrowers and lenders, to discuss and decide what is the debt architecture that we need. So yes, we need a fair and transparent multilateral debt cancellation and restructuring mechanism, but we also need binding, responsible borrowing and lending rules, and accountability for implementation of responsible lending rules. We need a new approach to debt sustainability that is not led by the IMF and that is aligned with climate and sustainable development goals needs. We need an automatic debt service cancellation mechanism that protects global South countries on the wake of catastrophic events. So when a hurricane happens, that is not their fault. When an earthquake happens, when a war happens, they don't need to keep up with the debt payments, regardless of the clauses in their debt contracts. We also need to improve the debt contracts and the clauses. We need a binding global debt registry on debt. Stop asking for more transparency, set up the structures for more transparency and make them binding, and the place to do that is in the UN. We need debt audits to investigate and identify cases of illegitimacy of debt. We need the establishment of legislation domestically, and a UN Framework Convention could promote such domestic legislation in an aligned way, and we need regulation of the financial markets. We need regulation of asset management industries and credit rating agencies, including the establishment of an international public rating agency at the UN. I know it might seem a lot, but precisely we have this tool at the UN, which is the Framework Conventions, that would allow to open an intergovernmental process where, and I insist on this, all member states can discuss and decide democratically what they want to do about all these issues. We cannot guarantee that this statutory framework that we are proposing to reform the debt architecture will come in time to address the current debt crisis. This is why I said we need immediate debt cancellation. That is also something that we need to fight for. But is that in the light of the history of several decades, if we do not start discussing and setting up this new debt architecture today, we will be in the same situation in the next iteration of the debt crisis. So there is no time to waste to promote this debt architecture reform on the at the UN. I see Stefano looking at me. So just to say that FFD4 is a key opportunity for this. It is a long shot. It is very difficult. We saw what was delivered in the Pact of the Future, which is pointing at the IMF as the institution to deal with that architecture reform, which is the worst that could happen. So we know it is a long shot, but it is in the interest of everyone. It is in the interest of borrowers, but it's also in the interest of lenders and of financial markets to have an orderly system on that. And we need to argue for that. So summing up, great opportunity in FFD4. I hope all of you can join this collective efforts. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Yolanda. My name is Vitalis Meja. I'm with Reality of Aid Africa, which is also part of the CSFFD mechanism. And together with IBON International, we coordinate the work stream on international public finance. So on this agenda, we look at the issues of international development cooperation, and there are fundamental issues that are of concern for us that we think need to be looked at differently and not just regurgitate what we've had over the years. First of all is looking at the new narrative that needs to be put in place to ensure that indeed we are forward-looking and we are fit for purpose in the context of our call for a new international financial architecture. And in that regard, the issue of promoting right to development being the main fulcrum through which international development finance cooperation is handled is very important, and particularly how we use ODA, official development assistance, to achieve this objective is important. The reason why we raise this is because of the neo-colonial elements that are embedded within the ODA, the commercial interests and the foreign policy interests that are embedded within the aid system need to be taken out and really focus on how we support the aspirations of the communities and priorities of governments of the South that develop country programs that are democratically owned, meaning that they put citizens at the center, and that the international finance, particularly public finance, is supposed to support such programs and not anything else. So that is where we come at this, that indeed ODA must be directed towards that. Now, in that regard, what we're looking at is what are some of the norms and principles that need to inform this? Because currently, if you look at the norms, largely these are defined within the OECD DAC framework. So it is basically the donors who determine what defines aid, what it should be used for, and how it should be disbursed, and by what magnitude and when. And we are saying that that call itself is not sufficient and has been ineffective. So we need to think through what kind of a new model, a new framework that really democratizes this process and brings this and enables the voices of the South to be part of this debate in defining the norms, the use, the definitions of what aid should be and what it should be it should be used for. And for us particularly, we really argue that focusing on poverty eradication must be at the mainstream of this. At the same context is the issue of the principles that inform, especially the principles of democratic ownership, transparency, and accountability that should guide the ODA flows and the impact that it's supposed to take place. Now, to bring all this together, because we feel that currently there's no internationally recognized structure that helps define the norms and the principles, plus the roles and responsibilities of each stakeholder, we need to put one in place. And in that regard, we are calling for the creation of a convention, an international convention on international public finance, right? On how, and this should be able to create space where governments in the South, together with the North, can sit and agree on modalities of official development assistance. So that is very important. A second point, because I know we don't have a lot of time, is the issue of the point 7. We just don't want to go there and keep singing about you need to fulfill the point 7. I think that's we've had that song for too long. Now we are saying that these were commitments that have already been agreed to. There are countries that have already ratified this proposal, which means that they should be part and parcel of the national laws. Now, for these countries that have done so, this commitment, their failure to meet those commitments should be translated into a debt, should be public debt that is owed to the governments of the South. So what we are calling for is conversion of the non-fulfilled commitments into debt that should be paid to the governments of the South, and really work out a mechanism through which countries of the South can collect this debt. The same way IMF is demanding debts from the South through loans, that ODA also, because those are responsibilities and commitments that are made, we have to convert those now into debt now, and then be reclaimed. The second element of this is really to address the issue of reparation and the damages that countries of the North have done over into the South over the years. That we need that this debt in that context must also be accrued and collected, so that eventually you'll see that this net export of money from the South to the North, we need to address that imbalance by changing that narrative and turning it upside down. And for us, this is the mechanism to get us there. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Meja. And now I think our last intervention for this round, and then we'll open the floor. So be ready and warm up the engines for the discussion and for questions and more. Let me then ask our colleague Bhumika Muchala from Third World Network to step in with some kind of concluding considerations on the whole sort of systemic agenda for reforms that has always been embodied in the Monterrey Consensus, and really the challenge of democratizing governance that comes with it.
Hello all, thank you very much. And I'm going to try and I think just sort of step back and really address the fact that if we look back, if you can bear with me and just step back into the era of, you know, the decolonization era of, you know, where developing country states were really acknowledging that they have a sort of political and sovereign independence, but not necessarily economic independence. In the decolonization era, there was this articulation very much rooted in the UN General Assembly of a new international economic order that really addressed the imperative for economic decolonization, economic sovereignty, the right to self-determination, the acknowledgement of historical inequalities born of the centuries-long legacy of colonization. And in particular, there was a framing of the very concept of sovereign equality as that which incorporated the historical and systemic inequalities caused by colonization, and the ways in which the extraction and accumulation of the colonial process had resulted in a reality where sovereignty was not the same across the world, and that equality had to address the historical, you know, realities, the historical responsibilities. This is the genesis of the common but differentiated responsibilities. And in fact, in the conceptualization of sovereign equality was the element of historical reparations. The new international economic order was thwarted. It failed due to the geopolitical issues that withstand today, to this very day. Not much has changed in the contours of the geopolitical resistance and inability to really advance economic sovereignty. The right to development followed in the 1980s, very much led by the non-aligned movement, and the right to development again asserted the same core issues of the right to self-determination, that economic and social rights, economic and social development construed by that lens is a is a core aspect of human rights. And this was to counter the northern configuration of human rights as merely civil and political, as merely that of addressing the individual. So it was to collectivize the notion of rights and turn it into a structural systemic issue. And I take you through the journey of democratic governance to Rio 1992 that followed the 1980s, where the Rio principles laid out, again, common but differentiated responsibilities, the polluter pays principles, these principles to enshrine the systemic and structural inequalities between countries, to redress those aspects by considering the historical inequalities. And in the Sustainable Development Goals thereafter, there was a conceptualization of this means of implementation that had to address systemic issues, trade policy, economic policy, space, technology transfer, as well as the financial architecture. Financing for Development in 2002, when it started in Monterey Consensus, was the same idea of economic sovereignty, addressing the fact that in the 1990s, there was a steady, throughout the decades, there was a steady deregulation of two aspects, in particular, that of capital flows and that of the exchange rate. Exchange rates went to market-based exchange rates. Capital flows became liberalized across borders. And this addressed the core issue that developing countries came together to articulate in Financing for Development, the issue of the international monetary system, the ways in which exchange rates, capital flows, interest rates act together to essentially remove monetary sovereignty from developing countries. The Global South addressed the fact that they have very little monetary sovereignty. Money is power, international money is international power. So the international monetary system is at the core of Financing for Development, and that is where we come into systemic issues, in that interest rates and exchange rates in the Global South are not sovereign. They move up and down. They are in constant volatility, in a mirror refraction of developed country interest rates and exchange rates. Throughout the last 50, 60 years, as soon as the United States Federal Reserve, the United States central bank, raises its US interest rates, it causes shockwaves across the Global South. In 2022, when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates sharply in a series of interest rate hikes, in the 6 months consequent to those interest rate hikes, 90 developing countries' currencies depreciated. Why does this matter? When a developing country's currency depreciates in value, it results in a cost of living crisis. The actual value of the wages goes down. The goods of imports, the cost of commodities, the cost of food, the cost of a bushel of rice, the cost of the grocery budget goes up. The inflation is caused by external events. The currency depreciates by external events. So this is called the exogenous shocks. And this is the core of Financing for Development, that the Global South has so little economic sovereignty, so little self-determination and ability to maintain its economic and financial and currency stability. So what are the key demands? First and foremost, one of the key demands, going back to the very core, is the ability to regulate capital flows. The ability to regulate capital flows. And capital flow deregulation or capital account liberalization has been not only enshrined in free trade agreements, where it becomes a legally binding stipulation in free trade agreements, but it also become the economic consensus, the normative consensus. And this, in many ways, is what economic colonialism is about, that there is a quid pro quo agreement, not based on empirical evidence, not based on actual sound decisions that protect economic stability and security, but based on the interests of constantly enabling and creating a enabling environment for private capital accumulation, for investors to make profits. So this capital account liberalization is really at the core. Another key issue is, of course, the currencies and the interest rates, the lack of cooperation around currencies, where you have a constant pressure on developing countries to maintain attractive interest rates. These interest rates are to attract investors, to attract investment, to attract bondholders, so that they get a lucrative return on their investment. So in many developing countries, in fact, this is the perverse reality, which is the sheer opposite of reparations on a historical lens, that the poorer the country is, the higher the interest they have to pay. The poorer the country is, the prospect of having double-digit interest rates. These interest rates eat up so much of developing countries' revenue, where today, on average, a third of revenue in the lowest income countries is going into repaying creditors on just the interest value alone, on just the interest value of the debt repayments alone. Key to this is governance reform. We need developing country voices within the financial institutions. That is not being done because the international financial institutions make governance aligned to the economic power. We need to regulate credit rating agencies. We need to regulate commodities. We need to regulate financial flows. But in the very center of this, we need to revive the role of the developmental state, the role of the state to assert regulatory measures, to assert that capital flows should only be able to come in such and such ways, to be able to assert the right to have the policy space on the most core issues to economic sovereignty. So I leave you with that, the main message being the financing for development is a space to really invoke the need for regulation, for the right to development, and for economic sovereignty.
Well, thank you so much to all the contributors so far. I think hopefully this has provided you just a little bit of flavor, because there's of course many other dimensions to the FFD discussion, but at least this has been hopefully an informative introduction of the process, of its politics, and of the key propositions that a civil society FFD mechanism we are putting forward. Now, before opening the floor for general questions and discussion, I'd like to invite one of the key constituencies of the mechanism, the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities, to make a few remarks. Mohammed, please, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for giving us the opportunity as stakeholder group of persons with disabilities to be part of the discussion today. Before I start with my talking points, I would like to say that we are in agreement with everything that has been said in terms, particularly in terms of democratizing governance in order to make sure that real right to development is a reality. One key strategy and something that we've been calling for many years now is that in order for democratizing governance, we need to make sure that the financial architecture or the financing architecture is inclusive of all marginalized groups, particularly persons with disabilities, women, older people, youth, and so on and so forth. And when we talk about inclusion, it's not just a matter of words that should be injected here and there in policies or financial documents, budgets, and so on and so forth. Inclusivity requires that we need to budget for inclusion. We need to make sure that inclusion is a core principle in our financial architecture. And for that, there are lots of aspects that have to be recognized particularly the procurement for inclusion, engaging marginalized groups in decision-making about financial architecture. It's not enough to say, all right, well, this is what we want, and we leave it to governments to take care of it or financial institutions to take care of it. We have to be part of the decision-making process of this architecture, this new architecture we are calling for. And there are lots of resources and knowledge that's been spread around by organizations of civil society organizations, stakeholders that can explain how we can do that. So governments, financial institutions have no excuse to say, all right, we don't know how to do it. It's a burden for us. Well, it's more burden to perpetuate practices of exclusion and leaving everybody behind. So with this in mind, I'd like to say that as the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities, we support what has been already shared by the civil society FFD mechanism. We call for the following. We call for the OECD DAC disability marker to track how much official development assistance from development partners reaches persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, and that minimum criteria are adopted similar to the gender DAC marker. We express our support for the negotiation of UN tax convention for further protocols. We are calling for the establishment of a multilateral legal framework under the UN to comprehensively address unsustainable and illegitimate debt, including through extensive debt cancellation. These are of importance to us since both tax dogging and debt servicing take a severe toll on us and on the resources available to governments to fulfill the rights of persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups in accordance to international human rights law, particularly the CRPD, and with the Sustainable Development Agenda in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities. So floor is open for comments, for questions. I can see already a hand. Okay, I'm gonna start back in the room there, please. Then moving this way, okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Moses Isoba from Uganda. I think as we apply ourselves to financing for development, we definitely need a number of ways in which we can work around this. Some bit of innovation is necessary because it's a Herculean task that we're dealing with. But I was quite intrigued by what Vitalis made when he says, as countries, we definitely have a debt crisis. We are having a situation where we can't provide public services because of the debt repayment. And part of our work is to ensure that we improve the quality and quantity of ODA. Now, if we advocate for making sure that the ODA, because it's, as Vitaly said, it's a commitment, and we would like to count this as debt, the question is then, it's gonna undo the efforts of them increasing. Because if we're counting it as debt, then efforts of increasing will be curtailed because they would not like to increase their debt. Because what we're actually seeing now is that they are not reaching the 0.7 and we want to increase. Now, you don't want to ask the countries to be increasing what they are going to count as debt. And that in a way is gonna a bit of undo the efforts around increasing ODA, increasing the volume of ODA, and around the quality of ODA. We're talking about anti-tying aid, but at the same time, if we say we're gonna have to anti-tie it and make sure it is a debt, I guess there's a bit of going to be a challenge, but I would be keen to hear a bit more from Vitalis on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I have Carmen there. It's behind you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Carmen. I am from Bolivia. And I may sound right now like the dumbest person in the room, but we have, when we're talking about finance and we're not taking into account is the translation of the numbers. When we talk about trillions in English, we're talking about billones in Spanish. So when we're start going higher numbers and higher numbers, then it becomes confusing between English and Spanish, because 1 trillion in Spanish is 1 million billions. So when you say that there is a debt of, I mean, 20 numbers, 5 trillion in English should be 5 billones in Spanish. And it's really hard when you have to negotiate. And I think that's one of the first barriers that we face as Spanish speakers, because it is confusing. And it is confusing for me that I'm in the, and I know it's been confusing for a lot of delegates, because we've been talking about this, because our brain is not be able to do such math problems. And it's a problem of language. So, and it's a problem that we have to acknowledge, because it makes it hard, especially if we're all thinking in English and saying the numbers in English. When you have to translate to, it's a barrier, and it's a barrier that we have to start addressing if we all want to have a common language on what debt, taxes, and all these numbers mean, because they become so big that they can hardly fit in our brains. And I'm sorry if I sound a little bit dumb, because most of you, I know that you work in these issues all the time, but I want you to take into consideration that we have this barrier, that billions in Spanish is not the same or trillions. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen.
Hello, I'm Pradeep Besak GCAP. Thanks. I like your statement first, that they should be converted into debt, and additionally, they should start paying interest on that, right? I know nobody will accept it, but we'll speak what we have to speak. Okay, over that, on this subject, actually, when I lack knowledge. I'm not sure about others. There's something called Paris Club and London Club, and they are private group of donors. If you can throw a little more light on that, but my question is, have these private groups been absolutely left free by their governments to charge as much interest as they can on African countries, LAC and Asian countries? Is it not possible that these rich governments also regulate their private entities? And for civil society, is it necessary that we, apart from this FFD4 conference, we also engage with those governments? Now we have a pro-government, I don't know, the labor governments, never know when governments come, they forget all their ideals. But then we have a level government. Is it possible that we engage with them, bring some laws to regulate these clubs? But a little bit light on the club will be helpful, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think I have somebody just there in the back, and then we'll come forward in the room here. 1, 2, 3. Oh, the very last. Yes, I'll
thank
come
you.
back
Good
there.
morning. I'm Arjun. I'm from Nepal. Just my some intervention on in normally, like the IMF, World Bank, they are clever than us. Like for example, in many countries of Asia, they're like changing their priority. They are developing new project. I don't know we know on that, or because they are not providing direct loan or debt. They are providing some project, like for example, grid project. Now just they introduce a grid project, and for the grid, even the donor supporting, even the international NGO supporting, and the some part of the grid they are supporting as a debt, and some part of it like they're supporting like development aid. So it's very very difficult to understand as a civil society. So my question: how is civil society engaging in the real in the ground So how he giving the capacity building activity, how he engaging the larger, different kinds of momentum in the national level. This is very important to understand. The second things like, the government, of course they need the money, they need the resources. So there is a, we have lacking to in engaging with the government, and the government doesn't understand the politics of the donors or politics of this IMF or World Bank. So how we can, really, engage the national government, national, the parliamentary process. This is very important. So I think there's a international network, international platform. So there should be in, like, more engagement opportunity platform in the national level. So I like to request to the someone need to response, like how he's going in the, how he not only the, like, one of the events. So how we can, systematic, organizing the national process, the regional process, and the global process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I have quite a lot of hands. So let's see if we can manage to get them all there, and then Martha, and then here to the front, and then I have two on this other side. And then I think probably we'll wrap it up. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Julie Kofod. I'm from the UN Foundation. I would be really keen to hear the panel's reflections on what the most sort of poignant leverage points or incentives are to essentially pressurize the global north governments to deliver on some of these asks. And I'm asking specifically because we've seen for quite a few years now that some of these countries are pushing up against very hard red lines. You've seen that at the FFD forum last year for the SG summit, this year again. So what are the actual incentives that we can turn up, not a notch, but maybe 10 notch, to fight fire with fire a little bit, to be quite frank, to get the results that we are all asking for? And I do like the idea about translating some of the lack of delivering on commitments into debt as well. We talked about that in Addis. I think even if it's not a hard pressure point, it's something that is in that bag. So I would love to hear the reflections on what actually can be used across the board by all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. And there, Martha.
Buenos días. I am very concerned about how we are dealing with all this, because some of us are already living the future. For example, my country is now called a hybrid democracy. That's a contradiction, but that's the way we are treated. Or we continue to be called developing countries, and what are we developing to? I want to say very shortly, I think that it's very important to take hold of what's going on, read the signs of the times, what's happening now and why, where are we, and where are we being taken? Where are we going to be by the end of this century? How are we going to start the next century, and especially the youth, the children, nature, peace? So I don't want a piece of peace. I want to see that development is really about peace. And it used to be that the women at Beijing, we said peace and development all of the time. So the other thing is that for me, it's important to know what is the meaning of development at this time. Because I agree with the person that was saying that, for us to really develop, really become what we should be, we got to make sure that we develop the mechanisms so that the budgets reflect this means, because otherwise forever. Now my country is the most indebted country in Latin America, and I am saying we got to really take time, because this is not an era of changes, this is a change of an era. Gracias.
Thanks, Martha. Here to the front, and then we go back, and then I go back to the panel.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So my name is Pamela, and I am the World Federation for the Deaf, the WDF, and a member, and I am a member of IDA, International Disabilities Alliance. So listening to the panelists and the challenges that were proposed, that we're facing regarding finances for the development countries, I agree exactly what everybody's saying. The cancellation of the debt for the global south is extremely important. And because they need to be developed, they need to improve, it needs to be developed, yes. Therefore, right now, the International Day for sign language. We need to recognize this. It needs to be recognized from the UN. We have 2016, since 2016, and it's important to, again, have those funds. We all are fighting it, but we need to make sure that we are included, and we need to make sure that we have access to people with disabilities regardless, for sign language inclusion, for access for language for the deaf children who are born from age 0 to it's important to have that language for deaf people to have, because then they're playing catch up through the rest of their lives. So we need accessibility for everyone, for people with disabilities, to be in an equal foot plane so that we can continue. And so that's why it's important to keep keep fighting for the funds. Never forget to fight for accessibility funds, for accessibility. Include those in every topic that you talk about. Make sure you include those funds. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this contribution and generally for the ongoing contribution of the stakeholder group of persons with disability within the mechanism. So I have two last interventions there, and then I think I'm going to ask our colleague Zia to give us some sharp reactions, because we are, as usual, against time. Go ahead, please.
So thank you so much. My name is Charles Mwangi. I work for Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. And maybe just to mention, this death issue is becoming a big ticking time bomb, especially in the developing countries. I'm told in my country, Kenya, out of all the resources we collect, 67% goes into payment of debts. And so is the case with many developing countries. And the biggest question we do ask ourselves, if you take a hypothetical loan, probably that you're paying, give a hypothetical figure of about 8%. And the economy is growing for, at a rate of probably 4%. How do you expect to pay a loan at that interest rate when your economy is growing at a much, slower rate than the interest rate? That one tells you that we continue getting into deeper debts. But even what is more worrying is the fact that climate finance that should actually come to redeem our people is also coming in form of loans. And the developed world want to report that money as resources that is being committed to climate change. If I take a loan and I'm paying for that loan, then you cannot call that climate finance. I'm paying for it. And therefore, transparency in terms of how this money is reported is very critical. Because you can't give me a loan and expect that you are going to, tag that as climate finance. But number two, there is a whole question of climate for debt swaps. We owe loans, yes, to our partners from the north. But at the same time, they also owe us climate debt. And I think we need to, expand that conversation around then how can we be able to, come up with methodologies and mechanisms of climate, for debt swaps. And that one probably would be helpful and will give relief, especially to countries that are already experiencing, climate challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last intervention from the floor.
Okay, my name is Halima Nyota from Kenya. Two concerns, actually one, the discussion of inclusion and international financial architecture. If by any chance next year it becomes a successful, I'll be interested to know how do we structure it in such a way that member states do not take it as an opportunity to extract resources from the general development of their respective countries, so that we are not paying attention at the global space and forgetting about the individual responsibilities of member states to ensure development of their respective countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for all the points. Maybe I'm gonna ask Meja and Yolanda to get started, because quite a lot of comments and questions were also related to development cooperation and debt. But then I'll invite all the others also to step in with any further comments or concluding comments they may want to have. Who is going to start?
I just said that I could start. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the very interesting questions and proposals. On the issue of billions and trillions, I'm from Spain. I don't know if Carmen's still here, but Let's stop talking billions and trillions. Let's start talking structural reforms. We have committed, or they have committed to billions and trillions, and they do the talk, but they don't do the action. Let's reform the global financial architecture and the economic global governance. So when there is an agreement, actually there is an implementation. So I think that is a solution of that problem. On Paris Club and London Club, the Paris Club is Western creditor countries. The London Club is banks, which are not so relevant right now because it's more like asset firms and investment firms, the London Club. So it's basically central banks that set up the interest rates, and then these asset management firms and investment firms jump into that and raise the interest rates again. So it's like the financial markets more than the Paris Club or the London Club. This is why we're calling for a regulation of financial markets, including credit rating agencies. How CSOs can do engagement in the ground, given the difficulties, the colleague from, I think it was Nepal, to understand also IMF, World Bank, and all these institutions. We are organizing together with many organizations the Global Days of Actions against the IMF and the World Bank policies between the 15th and the 27th of October, and we will be organizing popular education and kind of basic introductions on what is the IMF, what is the World Bank, what are their policies. So we're trying to do a lot of that as well. It's not a solution, but it's an offer. What are the leveraging elements for pushing the global north in the different issues, and particularly in my case in the UN Convention on Debt, as the colleague from the UN Foundation asked? I think the first incentive needs to be pressure, so mobilizations on the streets. We need pressure from the streets. We need mobilization. We need to influence the narrative, so we need to influence the media. There is a chance next year, because again, a Jubilee year, like the 2000, so Jubilee 2025. So faith-based organizations will be mobilizing for canceling the debt. We can all jump, regardless if we are agnostic, atheos, or faith-based, in that mobilization. Also arguing that it is on everyone's interest. And finally, we need the Global South to champion this before anything else. That is what pressures Global North countries the most. It's the Africa group tabling the proposal for the, so they cannot say no. And finally, for Pamela on the cancellation, it's also inviting you to join these collective spaces. I was listening to you, and I was thinking maybe we can organize an action within the Days of Action or the Jubilee 2025, calling for debt cancellation on sign languages throughout social media together. I think there are plenty of joint mobilization moments coming ahead. October 15 to 27 is this Global Days of Action, but we also will have the Jubilee 2025 campaign. So I'll reach out to you later, and maybe we can organize something together. And yes, let's call for pay up for the climate debt and reparations. That is a main call that we need to push forward again.
No, thank you very much. I want to start from the statement made about the participation and engagement of people from the national level. And here, I think, actually, the main incentive comes from the political pressure that emanates at the national level. And it is not just the governments of the South, but largely for this agenda to work, citizens of the North must take action, because it is their voices, their pressure, that will get their governments to behave appropriately. For me, that should be the first element of point on how we socialize and educate our population around commitments, human dignity, and the role that their governments ought to play in shaping and redirecting the development agenda globally and also nationally is critical. So it's not just a discussion we have here at the UN and global structures, but really addressing some of the fundamentals that exist because these things we have this discussion here, but when you go back to our capitals, there's really nothing much happening. So we need to start addressing that. But also we flip that on the south, and really also begin building the political pressure so that governments understand that this is what the citizens want. And you saw that in Kenya. When government understood that this is what the citizens want, they had to call IMF and pull off the program. So it is possible. It is an incentive. Now, the other element that my dear friend Moses raised, that whether translating ODA commitments into debt is going to disincentivize the governments. Actually, here we are looking at a change of narrative and not look at it from a technical aspect, but really a political narrative, where we are saying that actually this call is an incentive to pay, because naturally the behavior is you don't want to accumulate so much debt. You want to get rid of it as much as possible or as soon as possible. So if you convert the non-payments into additional debt and then you add the interest, which my colleague was saying here, countries will want to comply more than not want to comply. That's the point we are trying to make. And we are saying that actually through this 0.7, you don't need this mantra of from billion to trillions using private sector. The role of development state, like my friend Bumika was saying, that governments take this as a responsibility to invest in services and in programs that secure, poverty eradication programs, is resources that should come majorly from the public coffers. And so in that regard, where we say that, and just to add to that is a question that ODA originally was meant to address economic development and poverty eradication. So we need to be able to ask governments, is our aid addressing poverty eradication? Is it promoting economic development in those countries? Not about how much ODA is creating more commercial interests or making us influence more, manipulate the political scenarios in the South. So for me, these are the most important elements that we have to look at when it comes to the question of fulfilling those responsibilities, global responsibilities for the world in making the world a better place.
Thanks, Measure. So I think if there's any concluding considerations, Bodo, Emilia, Rodolfo, Bhumika.
Yeah, just on the questions, which issues currently have, it's done? Yeah, okay. Which issues currently have traction? I think, one thing that we've seen a lot in moving forward recently is matters related to international taxation. I think one of the key developments also in the current outcome document, Impact of the Future, was the inclusion of the billionaire tax or taxation of high net worth individuals. So I think this is moving, and this should probably be further pushed. Then on debt, I think the main difference between FFD4, the situation we have now, and Addis Ababa is the severe debt crisis in the global south, and we hear governments from all corners basically addressing this. No one is satisfied with how the current debt architecture works. So I think also there's one issue that has traction. It's highly geopolitical, of course, because Western creditors and China are basically having their disputes on who should foot the bill. But I think debt architecture reforms also moving forward. ODA, Meja and I have been working together for many years on these topics. At the moment, most major donors have actually a downward trend. When we look at Europe, at least Germany, France, they're all cutting, UK is cutting. But in my view, actually, I totally like the idea to put the ODA regime more on a legal basis, because one of the main problems we have in most donor provider countries is that most of their expenses are basically protected by law. Well, ODA is not. ODA is from their perspective a voluntary expense. And when countries are moving back to contractionary fiscal policies, when they're moving back to austerity, it's always an easy target to cut ODA. And this is what we are seeing in many European countries at the moment. So basically, having a legal basis, as you suggested, is actually a pretty good idea. It's, so this main issue, and indeed, the international financial architecture reform continues to be moving. The World Bank reform process is ongoing. But of course, most major shareholders don't want to give away power at the moment. So moving it in the direction that the countries from the global south wanted. So governance reform, this will be a key challenge also for FFD4.
Thanks, Bodo. Emilia?
So there is a genocide in Gaza, and the entire multilateral system has been dismantled by imperial powers of Western countries. They're criminals in all of the agendas, in trade, in debt, in tax, in technology, in digital agendas, in every single thing, in climate, every single thing. Developed countries are responsible for 92% of excess carbon emissions. So the destruction of the planet is on their hands. They're also responsible for the 70% of the extraction of global resources. 50% of it is in the global south to fulfill their needs in the global north. They are literal criminals. And I want to be very clear about this because the FFD agenda is precisely not only about setting norms, but about tackling structural reforms. And what we need to do is to promote exactly the reform of the entire economic system that is allowing these criminals to continue on their lifestyle and the way they are carrying out the use and the misuse of the multilateral setting. So this is why it's really important for especially colleagues in the global north. Do not ask us what you need to do. You know you have been dismissed, you have been omiss, you are responsible, you have been complicit, or you have been enabling what is happening now. Bhumika just gave us a full account of all of the struggles of developing countries across decades. Do not ask us what you need to do. You are responsible, you are complicit, and you are enablers of the global crimes that are happening now. So what has to do with FFD? Everything. Because this is the moment in which we can confront all of those logics, all of those premises, all of those points of entry through which the technical dimension becomes so political. And the faith of the life of people and the planet, it's at stake now. So we cannot let it just to the UNFCCC and, we cannot. We need to go into all of the spaces and we need to make very sure that developing countries are doing their share. The civil society is also trying to come up with all of these innovative, creative ideas, but without global north people to mobilize and undertake the responsibility. This is not going to happen. And so we will make whatever progress it is, such as in the tax convention, but don't take it for granted. These criminals are really dismantling everything, the Security Council, the ICJ, the ICC, everything. And even this is what they did with the Pact for the Future. This is why they're ratifying themselves in every single thing. They deleted the para on climate and war. They deleted everything. So you tell me what you like about the Pact of the Future, what you love about, what is it inspirational for you? If what they did was to ratify the current system. So this is the moment in which you all need to be involved. And for us in the global south, we keep on fighting. We keep on being radical and bold. But for people in the global north, don't stay comfortable. You need to degrow your own economies. We need to challenge the growth is paradigm, the GDP logic, everything that stands in the type of living that you have. So this is what the FFD group is trying to propose also from the economic and environmental and the feminist groups, that we are saying we need to rupture the system. We cannot keep on betting on the reforms and the small tweaks of the system. We need to rupture the system, and this is an opportunity to do that. And we will not be satisfied with technical solutions or with those who are proposing, let's not touch the elements. So this is why CBDR, fair shares, equity, those need to be at the heart of the principles. And for us, we are not the UN. We are really calling for the safety of people and the planet. We have a mission, we have a responsibility. So I hope you all take it with us. Thank you.
Un primer punto es sobre lo que se habló de los términos usados en las sumas, en billones, trillones. Hay que considerar que sí, hay distintos, no solo el español es, ¿no? Digamos, divergente con lo que se pueda pensar en inglés, sino en portugués, por ejemplo, sí es más o menos se maneja lo mismo, billones y trillones. y debemos de pensar en más bien la mejor forma de comunicar en distintos idiomas, de que no solamente es cuestión de montos de dinero, sino que hay que buscar transformaciones. Saludo el esfuerzo que se hace acá por tener interpretación en varios idiomas, gracias a los intérpretes. También la interpretación que hemos tenido con lenguaje de señas acá en vivo, ¿no? Y que deberíamos tenerla vía Zoom también, creo, ¿no? En nuestros diversos eventos que hacemos. El segundo punto es sobre, bueno, los temas que hemos estado hablando. Tenemos deuda por un lado, tributación por otro lado, la ayuda oficial al desarrollo. Estamos hablando de recursos públicos, pero también está el asunto de la inversión privada, que también es un tema que está dentro de lo que trabajamos en el mecanismo del FFD, y que también se viene con todo en esas negociaciones, porque para cerrar esa brecha de financiamiento que tenemos, lo que nos dicen es hay que promover más financiamiento privado, hay que atraer más inversiones privadas, hay que utilizar mecanismos e instrumentos financieros de todo tipo para lograr cubrir esa brecha. Entonces, eso es una también de las preocupaciones que tenemos, de que se detengan estas formas de promover inversión privada a través de asociaciones público-privadas, financiamiento combinado, emisión de bonos de todo tipo, canjes de deuda también que se mencionó por ahí, debt swaps, también es uno de esos instrumentos que se están usando para supuestamente tener más financiamiento y luchar contra el cambio climático, pero nosotros venimos trabajando eso también, vemos que no solucionan ninguno de esos dos problemas. Y lo mismo pasa con todos esos bonos de todo tipo y de todos los colores que vemos que se están promoviendo. Así que también hay que estar atentos con eso. Gracias.
I'm just going to make my remarks very brief to conclude because you've been so patient and everyone's, I agree with all my colleagues and comrades and lifelong friends here. Absolutely, we are in a juncture of crisis. My one plea is this, right? Please do not be fooled by the reformist and feel-good language of the United Nations when it comes to international solidarity on the social development issues. And in particular, I just want to give you 3 examples. When it comes to women and girls, and when it comes to gender equality, there is structural component. In all of these areas, there are structural components. Women and girls are subject to malnutrition, deprivation, and violation of their economic and social rights to go to school, to have enough to eat, to have a fulfilled life, to have a meaningful, dignified life, in large part because essential public services and health and education are routinely, chronically foreclosed. They are cut and cut and cut. They are denied for women and girls due to the regime of austerity. We have a chronic, embedded, systematic regime of austerity because of debt, but also because you have to appease the investors and keep financing low. You have to keep the deficits low. So the social sectors are never scaled up. Even after you graduate out of IMF loans, health and education spending is rarely ever scaled up, let alone climate adaptation financing. When it comes to climate change, you will hear so much language on environmental social governance, ESG, climate debt swaps. You'll hear language about mitigation. You'll hear language about offsets and net zero in the private sector. Let's please get structural. Climate change requires not just financing, but technology transfer. Technology transfer is ruled by intellectual property rights that disable the transfer of environmentally sound technologies to the global south at equitable terms. Intellectual property rights is probably the most colonial construction in the global economy. It is what capitalism is rooted in. Property rights, and today intellectual property rights. So the biggest corporations, all of their profits are due to patents. Climate change, the key issue is going to be technology transfer, but also let me point to the most structural dimension of all, and I end with this, the imperative, the urgency for structural transformation. All the inequalities we talked about in debt and in ODA, in financing for development, is going to be weaponized in the context of climate change. Climate change will worsen and deepen these inequalities. So the fact that because of a long history, 500 years of colonization, the global south is the provider of cheap raw materials, is the provider of cheap labor, is the provider of cheap cash commodities, and just about everything the global north has in their supermarkets, to the raw materials they have for their industrialization. This will be further weaponized under the guise of critical raw minerals in the advent of climate change. So we must address this structural transformation where the global south has the ability to diversify their economies away from extraction and commodity crops, away from the plantation and mining that much of the global south has been locked into. So this diversification requires technology, requires financing, but requires economic sovereignty. So please, I beg you, get structural. Think about the structural elements behind all of the statements. Thank you.
Well, let me just conclude by thanking everyone, not only all our interventions here, but everyone that has attended and has contributed to the session, and invite all of you to participate in the process. The Civil Society Financing for Development Mechanism is an open space. Anyone who's interested to participate can join, can participate in the process, join the different work streams, and hopefully we will all be able to speak with one strong collective voice as civil society and social movements in this process. Many thanks and a round of applause to all of us.
Today was the first time I came in on the train. I'm like, oh, that's where I live. It's trees.